totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website bookedonrock.com. Michael Goldberg is a returning guest. He's back on to talk about his new book, Addicted to Noise, the music writings of Michael Goldberg. Addicted to Noise, which includes a foreword by music journalist and critic Greil Marcus, collects the best interviews, profiles, and essays Michael Goldberg has written during his 40-plus years as a journalist. From combative interviews with Frank Zappa and Tom Waits to essays on how Jack Kerouac influenced Bob Dylan and the lasting importance of San Francisco's first punk rock club, Goldberg, as novelist Dana Spiotta wrote, quote, shows us how consequential music can be. Contained within the pages are interviews with Sleater-Kinney, Sonic Youth, Patti Smith, Lou Reed, Flipper, John Fogerty, Neil Young, and Rick James, along with profiles of Robbie Robertson, John Lee Hooker, James Brown, The Clash, Prince, Michael Jackson, the Flamin' Groovies, Ramblin' Jack Elliott, X, Laurie Anderson, Stevie Wonder, George Clinton, Devo, San Francisco punks, crime, and more. Plus, short takes on Muddy Waters, Townes Van Zandt, Captain Beefheart, Professor Longhair, and others. Michael Goldberg is a journalist, novelist, and photographer. He's been interviewing and photographing musicians since he was 17. While a junior at Tamalpais High School in Mill Valley, California, he managed to interview the Grateful Dead's Jerry Garcia. He was a senior writer and associate editor at Rolling Stone magazine for a decade. In 1994, he founded the first web music magazine, the award-winning Addicted to Noise, and was a senior vice president at the SonicNet music site and subsequently at MTV Online. A playlist of the songs we talk about in this episode are on the show notes page. Michael, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Last time you were here, you were talking about your book, Wicked Game, the true story of guitarist James Calvin Wilsey. This time, you're on to talk about your brand new book, Addicted to Noise, which is all about your career, which spans, 47 years?
Yeah. This book draws from interviews, feature stories, profiles, and essays, Q&A interviews from 47 years. I mean, the earliest piece in here is a Q&A interview that my wife and I did with Frank Zappa back in 1975. And the most recent piece is on the little known but first feminist all-women rock band called Eyes. And I wrote that piece within the month of turning in the final manuscript. I had to turn it in January 1st of this year.
And this book goes all the way back to your interview with Jerry Garcia when you were just a teenager. This was your first big interview, right? With Jerry Garcia?
Absolutely. I was 17 years old. I mean, 17. I was 17 and I was between, I think I was between sophomore and junior year in high school. And a friend of mine and we were big fans of Rolling Stone. I mean, we loved Rolling Stone. And we decided, why don't we start a rock magazine for the Bay Area? And I had some money saved up from my bar mitzvah money and I don't know what else, but I had some money saved up, in the bank. So we published this magazine called Hard Road. And it was called Hard Road because John Mayall, John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, he had an album called A Hard Road. And so the thing was, the idea was that the musician's life is really a hard road, for most musicians. And so that's where the name came from. And the thing was, we were friends with the son of the great disc jockey and progressive underground radio founder, Tom Donahue. I mean, if you were in the Bay Area, you knew Tom Donahue. I mean, he was involved in putting the Beatles on at the Cow Palace, I believe, as a co-promoter, and other shows. He had a record company called Autumn Records that the Beau Brummels recorded for. Sly Stone was the producer. I mean, this guy was like a true entrepreneur, but he was also an incredible lover of great music.
He launched the first FM rock station.
Absolutely, KMPX here in the Bay Area. So anyway, his son went to Tam High School, which is where myself and a friend of mine went to school. I'd parked my car, and his father, they lived up on Mount Tamalpais, a fair ways up. And so I parked on the side of the road. We were walking up. Basically, the road went up to his driveway, and then his driveway went down to this, mansion. So as we're walking up, standing at the top of the driveway, talking to someone is Jerry Garcia. And so I went up to Jerry Garcia and I said, "Excuse me, but we're starting this rock magazine called The Hard Road, and we would love to interview you." And I'm just hoping, I mean, basically at 17, you think anything is possible,
What do you have to lose?
And he says, "Sure." And I say, "Well, when can we do it? We have to bring a tape recorder and everything, And he says, "Well, let's do it." I don't know, I can't remember now, but something like, "We'll do it next Tuesday at my house. This is my address." He gives us his address, and he said, it's like, "See you next week." So then we show up next week, and I've got a back then, as far as I know, there were no cassette tape recorders. This is 1971, I guess. And I don't think if there were cassette tape recorders, they weren't tiny little things. They were bigger. But anyway, I didn't have one. What I had was a reel-to-reel tape recorder that was, 3 feet by 2 feet or something like that, fairly heavy, and a microphone, separate microphone that you plugged into it, and then you had to put the reel of tape on and put it through the thing. And, so anyway, we show up. I'm carrying this tape recorder, carrying a bag with my camera, and then, got 2 friends with me. We knock on the door, and Mountain Girl answers the door. Mountain Girl being Jerry Garcia's, I don't think they were married at that point, but they were, she was his living, girlfriend, and kind of legendary. And she answers the door. "What are you, kind of looking at us very skeptically, like, what are these kids doing here?" And, I say, "Well, we're supposed to interview Jerry Garcia, And she's like, "That's weird, because he's supposed to leave for the Keystone Berkeley. He's playing there tonight." And I'm like, "Oh my God," But she goes back, and he comes out, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, okay, come in. We'll do this right now." So we go into the living room, set up the tape recorder, and we did this interview, and I took some photographs. And so that was my first real interview.
And there's a quote Jerry gave you that you write in the book. It stays with you to this day. What was that quote?
So the question was, "Do you agree with some of the people that rock music is a manifestation of revolution?" And you got to remember, this is 71. We're really still in the 60s. I mean, they're over, but we're still in the 60s. Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, go the whole Chicago debacle, when all these people were in Chicago and the police beat everyone up, and Weather Underground, all this stuff has been going on, right? That's all like present day at this point. And he says, "It isn't that to me, but I could see that someone could think that it is. Yeah, I agree that there are people that say that. Yeah. Well, I think that the whole thing about what revolutions are is all completely different. I mean, the unfortunate thing about the revolution that's going on now is that there's a lot of people that are still sticking to like an old line revolutionary tack, which has been shown to be a miserable failure. And it's I think that the revolution that's going on is going to make some sort of dent, or some change is already over. It's already happened in principle, and the waves of it are now moving away from ground zero at the rate of about, a mile every 4 years." And he laughed, or something like that. It's going real slow, but eventually the whole world will be a different place as a result of things that have already happened. It's already gone. It's already passed. And the rest of it is like telling everybody who missed it that it's already happened. A friend of mine says that it's a cleanup action, mop up action. And I'm inclined to agree with that. And what I wrote in the book was, and what I believe is, that Garcia was saying that a philosophical change had occurred in the mid 60s. And some people understood that, got it when it happened, and were living their lives with different values of love and empathy and community, not consumerism, everyone for themselves and the almighty dollar rules, valuing creativity and staying true to one's beliefs rather than pursuing money as the be all end all. Or at least that's how I interpreted what he said. I thought music, art, writing, film, and photography were the most important things in the world, and writing and photography were what gave my life meaning. Maybe what Garcia said that day helped me pursue what mattered to me, writing about music and musicians and photographing them at a time when almost no one thought you could make a living as a rock critic. It was inspiration to hear that. And I thought I completely got what he was talking about. I mean, it made total sense to me that, the change had happened. It had happened when rock bands started playing ballrooms in San Francisco. The psychedelic bands started playing there, and when people, like I said, people started living in communally, and people started focusing on art and community and love, and not on the whole 50s straight and narrow. You got to remember, the 50s was a really conservative time in the United States. I mean, super conservative. And it was like, the man in the gray suit kind of deal. As a teenager at that time, being immersed in what had been going on since when I was 12 years old, or 13, I went to the Haight-Ashbury. And I mean, it was literally mind blowing to walk along Haight Street at that particular time. I mean, everywhere you looked were like colorful posters and people hanging out of windows from second store apartments and marijuana in the air. And it was this whole freewheeling kind of thing, like you just never seen before. And I'm 12 years old or 13 or something, and that just had made such an impression on me. And I'd read everything I could about what we would call the counterculture.
When did you begin working with Rolling Stone?
Well, I started writing as a freelance writer. Actually, my first was funny because I hadn't seen Ben Fontoures in about 40 years or something. I saw him the other night, and I reminded him that in 1978, I think it was, he called me up and he said, I heard someone told me you were at when Mitch Ryder played the Old Waldorf the other night, and that you were taking photographs. We need a photograph of him for Random Notes. Do you have one? And I mean, this was like, I was like about to fall over because, Rolling Stone was like, right back then, it's hard for people to understand now, but back then, Rolling Stone was it. There was Crawdaddy and there were a few other music magazines, but Rolling Stone was like the Bible of rock and roll. I mean, you just lived for getting the next issue, which came out every 2 weeks back then. That was where I wanted to write for, So I was just like thrilled, and I got some photos to him, and my first appearance in Rolling Stone was a photograph of Mitch Ryder in Random Notes.
And what year would that be? Late 70s?
That would have been 78. I'm pretty sure it's 78.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was kind of my start, but then it was a number of years. When I had my first article in there was actually a piece on Carlos Santana. That would have been, I don't know, maybe 1980, 81, something like that. And then I did some other stuff. I mean, I lucked onto an interview with Van Morrison, which I've included in the book. I did that. And then I interviewed Devo, which is also in the book. And Rolling Stone's reviewers, there had some reviewers, including Dave Marsh, that hated Devo. So subsequently, Devo didn't want to have anything to do with Rolling Stone. But Whip It became a hit. And suddenly Rolling Stone needed, they had to cover Devo. And I had done an interview with Devo and I was going to do it. I was at the time, I was the managing editor of a local San Francisco magazine called Boulevards. I had done the interview for Boulevards, but I pitched the editor, Jim Hinkey, who was the guy who had gotten the Carlos Santana piece from me and the Van Morrison piece. So I pitched him on this Devo story, and the timing was perfect because they really wanted a story on Devo, and Devo wasn't going to talk to them. So I did the story that's in the book for Rolling Stone, and I think Devo were really happy with it because I was a person who loved Devo. So I was not Dave Marsh, who basically said that when he finished his review, I think it said, "Now I'm taking the record and I'm breaking it and I'm throwing the pieces in the trash can." I don't know what it was. I thought Devo were just brilliant from the first time I heard their single. I think it was Jocko Homo as a single that they had released independently, and then when their first album came, I thought they were amazing. But anyway, so I was getting these pieces into Rolling Stone, and at first I was kind of lucky. They needed something that I happened to have, and so then they started giving me assignments, and I did a piece on Rick James when Street Songs was becoming a hit, and then I later did more. I did a big piece on Rick James that's in this book. Anyway, so that's how I started writing for Rolling Stone, and then at a certain point, I had done a story I did on radio, and basically the end of underground radio that I included in this book ran in Esquire. And so I think when they saw that story in Esquire, I think that's when the music editor thought, we better hire this guy because he's good. I mean, he's doing things like I would do real reporting. A lot of times people would just go to a conference room, sit down with whoever the artist was, interview him for an hour or so, and then write a story based on that. But I would talk to the artist's mother. If I could get them to let me talk to their mother, I would do that. I would talk to their producer and their manager and guys in the band and friends of anyone I could get to that really knew the person, I would talk to. And so I thought my stories were much more rounded and much gave the reader a better picture as opposed to you just getting the story from the musician themselves. So I think that all of that came together, and they decided, we should get this guy on staff. And so they hired me basically at the end of 1983. And it's kind of weird, but I officially started work on January 1, 1984.
Yeah.
which because of the book 1984, it's a strange date, but
George Orwell.
That's when it started.
And you were there until the early 90s, or was it the late 80s? When did your
No, I was there until about midway or so through 1993. Okay. I was there almost 10 years.
And what happened? What was your reason for leaving?
Basically, they fired me. And they fired me because I think there was a bunch of reasons, but one reason was my editor, Jim Henke, had left. We were a great team from my perspective anyway. He wanted certain things in stories, and he communicated that to me early on. And then I understood that, and he really knew about what comprised a good story, what you needed. So I learned a lot about writing feature stories and news stories from Jim Henke. And so we just had this really good working relationship where if he gave me a story, he could count on the fact that he was going to get a really good story of what he wanted, that I was going to do everything that it took. I mean, there's a story in this book that I did for Rolling Stone on James Brown. And at one point, one of the musicians who played for Brown, I don't know if I think this is when James Brown had been arrested. And this guy was in Atlanta, and I flew to Atlanta, and in the afternoon, I interviewed Bobby Bird, who was a key member and actually the guy who got James Brown started in a band. I had interviewed Bobby Bird and his wife, who was a singer. And then, I don't know, 8 or 9 o'clock at night, I went to this hotel where this musician was. We started our interview 9 or 10, and we went like almost all night long, as I recall. I mean, we went for hours. I mean, I didn't sleep that night. When I was done talking to him, I can't remember now if I flew to Atlanta or anyway, but when I was done talking to him, basically I left and went back to Augusta because I was reporting this story that in James Brown Augusta was where James Brown was based. So a lot of his musicians were in Augusta. His lawyer was near Augusta. Everyone I needed to talk to was there, but there were a few people in Atlanta. So anyway, I didn't sleep that night. And there were other situations where I was just like, I remember one time I was up like 48 hours working on a story. I mean, I would do whatever it took to get the story, to get, the information I needed so I could put together the best story I possibly could. And I just, for most of the 9 years, I lived that. But Jim Henke left at a certain point and he went to work at a record company. And then eventually the guy who became, for a while, there was another guy who was the music editor, and we were able to work pretty well together. But then another person became the music editor. And we did not click at all. He just didn't get it in terms of what I was good at doing. And I just couldn't, I don't know, we just couldn't really communicate. And so it just wasn't working. The other thing was that, when I started there, I started at X amount of dollars. But by the time, now we're talking 9.5 years later, I was making, I don't know, more than twice what I had started at. But the thing was, they could bring in, when I started working at Rolling Stone, I was 30 years old. They could bring in someone in their late 20s. I'm almost 40 now, right? But they could bring in someone in their late 20s, and they could start paying them practically what they had started paying me 10 years earlier.
There's the bottom line. It's the almighty dollar. Yeah.
And I also have to say that I had gotten kind of bored with the whole thing. I mean,
because I was going to ask, were you pissed off, or what was your mindset?
I had previously done 3 cover stories on Michael Jackson. And then I was asked to do another story on Michael Jackson, not a cover story, but another story. I mean, I was so sick of writing about Michael Jackson. I was just sick of that, to have to do another story on Michael Jackson. I don't know. And the thing was, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because for a little while I was doing some freelance writing again, but then I discovered the internet. And so then I started the first rock and roll internet magazine on the web. That was the end of 1994. I went live with Addicted to Noise, the online magazine, December 1st, 1994. And Hotwired from Wired magazine, they created Hotwired, which was an online magazine similar to Wired, but online. That went live, I don't know, 2-3 weeks before I did. They were the first online web magazine. I was the second web magazine. That was just a great thing.
Let's go through some of the interviews throughout your career that are in the book. And I want to start with John Lee Hooker, he's my favorite blues artist of all time. You first met him late in his life when he was experiencing a level of fame and financial success he hadn't throughout his entire career, and this is in 1991. He had some great stories to tell about his fight to become a star in those early days. Can you share a little bit of what he talked about?
He was working like jobs like a janitor and a movie usher in Detroit. I mean, these really crummy jobs. But what happened was, this record store owner, Elmer Barbie, saw him performing and became his manager. And they made some crude recordings, and he played them for this producer record company owner named Bernie Bessman. And Bessman took him into studio, United Sound, and they recorded 4 songs. One of those songs was the song that became Boogie Chillin', and Boogie Chillin' became a big hit. It was released on Modern, and that song was the basis for sort of the rock boogie that countless bands have played since then. I mean, and that's the thing is about John Lee Hooker is, and he's not the only blues musician who has influenced, rock musicians, but he was a key musician who influenced, the Rolling Stones and, the Doors. And I mean, the Doors covered John Lee Hooker, and, all these people covered John Lee Hooker. And so that was the beginning of his career. He basically he just went from being a janitor. He says that Boogie Chillin' comes tearing the world up. Everywhere you go, they playing it. You go in department stores, they playing it. Every time you turn the radio on, they playing it. Now here I am stuck in the plant. I said, here, take this badge. I ain't working here no more. I got to go. And that was it. And when I saw him, it was in the latter days of his life. But man, it was just a great time for him. He had done The Healer and, recorded songs with, people like Bonnie Raitt and a bunch of others. Yeah. And so these were like super successful albums for him. So it was just a great time for him, and the Rolling Stones had him up on stage on some of their tours. And even when he wasn't having hit records, he was always kind of there. I mean, there was a time when he was like touring with Canned Heat, but that end of his life period was spectacular for him. Yeah, I interviewed him he had a home in Vallejo and he had a home south of San Francisco. And I interviewed him in both places. And, the place in south of San Francisco, and I kind of start out the piece like this. It's so weird. It's just like this very suburban kind of ranch house, as I recall. And the thing is, so you go up to this place, it's nondescript. I mean, it's not like a mansion or anything like that. And it's like you knock on the door and there is John Lee Hooker. I mean, and it's just like mind blowing,
no bodyguards, no, you don't have to.
But I mean, it's almost like, you knock on the door and there's Elvis or something, or you knock on the door and there's like, a Martian or something. I mean, it's like so out of context is what I mean,
Yeah.
It's like, here's one of the great bluesmen of all time, and you just, I mean, and of course, it was very, very surreal.
2016, you had the opportunity to write about the influence of Jack Kerouac on Bob Dylan. You say that you learned much that you'd not previously known about Dylan. What did you learn?
Well, the big thing was that when Dylan, he was recording Highway 61 Revisited, he went to, in 1965, Dylan was in England, and Jack Kerouac's, one of his books came out, and Dylan ended up literally taking lines from Kerouac, that Kerouac had written, and put them into songs. And Dylan, he was so influenced by the beats. I knew Dylan being influenced by, folk musicians and, Ramblin' Jack Elliott and Woody Guthrie. And, because he was playing folk guitar, he was going around New York. He was following Ramblin' Jack Elliott around. He was going to the hospital where Woody Guthrie was. So that's the stuff. I had read all of that stuff. But what I didn't realize was how influenced, more than just influenced, how he was literally borrowing from some of the beats to create his songs. For example, in the book, I talk about Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And Dylan, Ferlinghetti, they had correspondence. Ferlinghetti was hoping that Dylan would write a book for City Lights Books, which was Ferlinghetti's book company. But Dylan, when he wrote It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, that is directly influenced by a Ferlinghetti poem. And there's certain lines that you can find in the Ferlinghetti poem, not literally, he didn't take those lines, but there's certain lines that are ideas that he got from there. In particular, the book that came out was Desolation Angels. And Dylan reworked 4 of Kerouac's phrases. Kerouac wrote, "They sin by lifelessness." And Dylan wrote, "Her sin is in her lifelessness." Cabinets with memories in them, which Kerouac wrote, became memories in a trunk. These are literally where he's taking something that is so, I mean, what he's writing is so close to what Kerouac wrote. Visions of Johanna, well, Kerouac had a book called Visions of Gerard. There's so many things. Like Kerouac has the phrase Housing Project Hill, and that's in a Dylan song from that period. So basically, this piece was an in-depth examination of how the Beats had influenced, particularly Kerouac, also Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, how their writing not just influenced Dylan, but practically imprinted on Dylan. The point of the essay wasn't to say, oh, Dylan's a thief. The point of the essay was just to sort of illuminate how this happened, that these albums, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, songs like A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Mr. Tambourine Man, this stuff didn't come out of a vacuum. This came out of the environment that Dylan had immersed himself in and what he was like, what he loved. I mean, he read Kerouac's book of poetry, Mexico City Blues. He was turned on to that. And he read that back when he was in Minneapolis before he moved to New York. He got turned on to that. He read a number of other Kerouac books at that time, including On the Road, and he loved that stuff. He wasn't reading it to get ideas. He was reading it because it's what he loved. Of course, because he loved it so much, it did really influence him. And then the fact that he took some lines and worked them into his songs, I mean, those songs are still are unique entities. It's like wherever he gathered the material from, the end result was a unique thing. It's almost like, okay, you take all these photographs, all these pictures from Life magazine or wherever, and you cut them up and you make a collage out of it. You didn't take any of those pictures. Every single one of them is a picture some other photographer took. But your collage is a unique artistic statement. That's what this piece, which is a pretty extensive piece, is all about. At the time I wrote it, I mean, people had talked about and written about Dylan being influenced by the Beats, but I don't think anyone had done as in-depth an examination as I do in this essay.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. What about the mystery man, Van Morrison? You say he can be a real jerk, at least if you're a reporter trying to interview him. There was a long stretch when he refused to talk with a reporter, but he talked with you. And this is in 1982. Well, he sort of talked to you. This is in 1982. What was going through your mind when he shows up for the interview, and how does this interview go?
Well, I mean, the thing was, again, like sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time, and it's sort of like you do everything you can to be prepared. And then when an opportunity comes along, you take it and you're ready for it, So it's like you can't make Van Morrison talk to you. But if Van Morrison agrees to talk to you, you're ready. So the thing in this case, Van Morrison was going to do a big show at this place in San Francisco. And for whatever reason, they decided that they needed a story in the San Francisco Chronicle's Sunday Datebook section, which is the big entertainment section. The Sunday Chronicle Examiner at the time was seen, 2 million people or something saw it. I mean, if you did a story in the Chronicle's Datebook section, anyone who cared about music was going to see that story. So they decided that let's try to get Van to do a story for the San Francisco Chronicle Sunday date book. And I don't know how I don't remember now. I mean, I think I was like just pitching and pitching, trying to get him to talk, because I was a huge fan of his. And I had been to all these club dates that he had done around the Bay Area. I had taken photographs of him. I mean, live photos. So anyway, he agreed to do this interview. So we met at this restaurant in Mill Valley. He lives in Mill Valley. I was living in San Francisco at the time. We meet at this restaurant, and he was very nervous, he was very uncomfortable. You could just tell the whole idea of this. And I'm just trying to I just want to try to get him to relax, I mean, and I'm like, well, where would you like to sit? We could sit inside, we could sit out in the courtyard. He says, well, where do you want to sit? I say, all right, well, let's sit. We could sit in here. We could sit. No, let's go out there. So we go out, and we're sitting out in this little courtyard, and I set up my tape recorder and I start interviewing him. I thought I got a lot of good stuff from him. But at a certain point, I mean, he was like, at that point in time, he basically was saying that he hated rock and roll. What he did was not rock and roll. He had done rock and roll years ago. He didn't do that anymore. He didn't like rock and roll. He didn't, and he just really had these really strong opinions, which come out in this piece. And then at a certain point, after, I don't know, we talked for, I don't know, half hour, 45 minutes, something like that. He says, I got to go. And I say, well, wait a minute, I'm not done. And he says, well, you know what? Come up to my house on Monday and we can finish this. And he gives me the address to his house. Okay. And then that's it. He takes off. So I show up at his house. I go to the front door and I'm knocking on the door and nobody's answering. And I'm like, oh my God, So there's the house, and then kind of below the house is, because this is up on Mount Tamalpais, which is there's these winding roads that go up Mount Tamalpais, and then you might have a garage, and then you go down a little bit, and then there's a house, and then kind of below the house, in this case anyway, was a beautiful kind of a garden. And so I go down into this garden and I'm sitting there. And while I'm sitting there, it's like a deer goes by or something, I mean, it's like, it's just really just you can understand why he likes living there.
Secluded.
And very secluded, but just beautiful. And I'm waiting, and I don't know, time goes by, I'm just hanging out, waiting. I figure he's got to show up. And at a certain point, a car pulls into the driveway, and he gets out of the car. I'm looking up. I'm starting to walk up now, and he looks and he sees me, and he starts going back to the car. I quickly walk up there and I say, Van, something like this, Van or Mr. Morrison, or, we're supposed to finish this interview. And he's like, oh, I can't do it. I got to go. Call me and we'll set up another time. That was, of course, that's the last time I ever saw him, in that kind of a way, that was it. I called. There was never any answer. Luckily, I interviewed a bunch of other people, like I always did when I would do profiles. And so I wrote the story for Rolling Stone that is in the book. And then I did another story that was in the San Francisco Chronicle's Sunday date book section. So basically they got what they wanted, which was the Sunday date book piece that helped them sell tickets, if that was really needed. I mean, I don't, Van Morrison, people love to see Van Morrison, but then I got to have a story in Rolling Stone that was one of the earlier stories, and that helped pave the way to me getting hired by them.
Is he like that with fellow musicians or just reporters?
He can be difficult with everyone. I mean, at least at that time. I mean, I can't speak to Van Morrison these days, but back then, I mean, Van Morrison, if you look at, I mean, obviously, I mean, a lot of people think Astral Weeks is like not only his greatest album, but one of the greatest albums ever made. And I agree with that. I think it's like just an amazing album. But the album he did before that was a solo album, has some really good stuff on it. It's a really good album. And then albums that he did after like that, his Band and Street Choir, and there's a number of, he made a bunch of really good albums in that period of time when he was recording for Warner Brothers Records. I mean, pretty much you listen to any of the albums he did for Warner Brothers, and those are really good albums. What happened later, not really going to speak to. It's not, that stuff just doesn't speak to me, but that period of time, incredible. But you talk to, I mean, I talked to, one of his producers for this particular story. I mean, this guy had talked about, in another publication, he had talked about how difficult it was working with Van Morrison, and Van Morrison was changing his mind all the time. And
Ted Templeman, right?
Yeah, you just never could, like, you didn't know what was happening, and the thing is, when I talked to Ted, he felt horrible about what he had said because what he said to me was basically, I didn't mean it that way. It came out wrong, whatever. I mean, Van Morrison has the right to change his mind, and there's nothing wrong with Van Morrison changing his mind. He's a great artist. And he said, I would die to be able to work with Van Morrison again. Because basically he was going to do an album with Van Morrison, and Van Morrison read these comments he'd made in this other publication, and that was it. But I mean, Van Morrison, I mean, Bill Graham was managing him. That fell apart. I mean, Van Morrison is just, I think for anyone to work with Van Morrison back then, it was a difficult situation. I think it was a difficult situation for musicians. I think for everyone. I mean, you just had to go with the flow with Van Morrison. And, that's the thing with a great artist like that. I mean, really a genius, a creative genius. Creativity is not something you can call up on demand. It's a very mystical thing. I mean, so many people talk about the idea, songwriters and writers, and people talk about the idea that this stuff just comes almost through them. It's not like they sit there and they intellectually construct it. It just, like Dylan has talked about this, he was on a roll in a certain period of time, and the songs were just showing up, and then they stopped showing up. And like I say, he's talked about this in Chronicles. An artist like Van Morrison, I mean, he can't just like summon up a song like Madame George, or it's like it happens. They're in the studio, and he's just he's hoping the magic is going to happen. And so if a musician is not, it's not going right with that musician, it's not going right with that musician. Or that producer, he's gonna say, no, we're not using that song, or no, sorry, Ted, no way.
Well, another guy that's been known to be difficult in interviews, Lou Reed. And you said you were scared to interview Lou Reed. I don't blame you. He was not fond of rock critics, did not like rock critics. You were told prior to this interview in 1996 that this was a much kinder and gentler Lou Reed now that he was in love. Did he live up to that promise?
He did. And the thing was, Laurie Anderson changed Lou Reed. After those two got together, he was a different person. I mean, not creatively, I don't think, but he was friendly. He was like, I mean, I had read these interviews. I had read these battles that Lester Bangs and Lou Reed had. I had listened to, there's a live album where on the record, Lou Reed is like tearing into Robert Christgau. I mean, it's like, now you're going to go and interview Lou Reed. Now, the thing that was in my favor, I thought, was that Lou Reed at that point was recording for Reprise Records, which is associated with, was like a label. Warner Brothers and Reprise were the two labels. And Howie Klein was the president of Reprise Records. And Howie Klein had been a friend of mine going back to 1977 or something like that. And so when the punk scene was starting in San Francisco. And so Howie put me on the phone with Lou Reed at one point, and we talked a little bit about a song that he had written that they had put out as a single, I think. And that conversation had gone well. So Howie set up for me to interview Lou at his office in New York. The fact that Howie was saying to Lou Reed, this guy, he's okay. And his publication, Addicted to Noise, this is good. This is going to be good for you to have this interview. You're going to be the virtual cover story of the publication. So I felt like going in that I had all that going for me, but still knowing Lou Reed's history, I was,
like I said, I don't blame you for being a little nervous.
I was worried, I think the interview went really well. And the surprising thing to me was that he talked a bit about the Velvet Underground, which I didn't expect that I was going to try to get him to say a few things about the Velvet Underground, but he brought it up himself. And then we, of course, mostly talked a lot about his new album and the songs on his album at that point. But I felt like it went really well. I had interviewed Laurie Anderson years earlier, which was really cool. Laurie Anderson, she had her hit with Oh Superman. So I arranged to interview her when she came to San Francisco. She was playing a show with William Burroughs at this, it was like a movie theater that was being used as a rock concert hall. So it was Laurie Anderson and William Burroughs and then this other poet, and Laurie Anderson was headlining. I was able to see this show, which was amazing. And then afterwards, the guy who had booked the show and Laurie Anderson and a few others and myself ended up at this restaurant. At the restaurant, I was able to kind of approach Laurie Anderson and say, could we do an interview? She said, well, I can't do it. I'm exhausted. I can't do it tonight. But if you could pick me up tomorrow morning and give me a ride to the airport, we could talk while you're driving me to the airport and while I'm waiting for the plane. We went, I had to take she had some equipment that she wanted to she was going to take, not on the plane, but as luggage. And so I met her at the venue. We loaded the equipment into the, my car. And then we drove to the San Francisco airport and I interviewed her all along the way. It was great, and then we hung out in the, at the airport and wait while she was waiting for her plane. So she liked that story. So to have interviewed her and then to do the Lou Reed interview so many years later, I felt really, I love being able to put those two pieces into the book back to back.
You're real proud of the articles you did on both Dennis Wilson and Brian Wilson. And the Dennis story, it was not easy. That's one you had to do some work on because the band wasn't going to talk to you, and for good reason. This is just a month after Dennis drowned, and you had set out to report on what happened. You did end up completing this story on Dennis by talking to friends, associates, current and former business partners with the Beach Boys. It is an absolutely tragic yet gripping story from the start. Leads off with the night of Dennis's death. Then you trace the reader back to find out what led up to his demise on the night of December 27th, 1983. You spoke with two people who were there that night with him. What was their account of what happened?
I got assigned to do a story on the Beach Boys, the current state of the Beach Boys. And I went up to Lake Tahoe where they were performing in January of 1983. And they wouldn't have, basically the management was there. I was trying to approach these people. They would not have anything to do with me. They did not want to talk to Rolling Stone. They didn't want to do anything. And so I was kind of trying to report a story about the Beach Boys without talking to the Beach Boys. Well, when Dennis Wilson died, then it was like, okay, now the story, this is a different story.
Oh, I got, okay. So now you were assigned the story prior to Dennis's death.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
Yeah. And so I ended up talking to a lot of people for this story. I didn't talk to any of the quote sort of official people, you know. I mean, I don't think I talked to anyone in the Beach Boys for the story, but I talked to people who were Dennis, who was an alcoholic at that point in his life. He had all these like alcoholic and druggy friends, you know. When somebody is sort of on a downhill slide, they end up with people around them that they might not otherwise have around them, let's say. And so those folks had witnessed Dennis up close during this period of time. And so this story is really a story about sort of the demise of Dennis Wilson that leads to him drowning. Yeah, I talked to the people who were there that night, you know, one of whom was a current girlfriend named Colleen McGovern. And then there was another guy there who was, you know, had been a friend of his, this guy Oster. They were there, you know, they were talking to him literally hours before he drowned, and then right up until he did. And they were trying to keep Dennis from drinking, but he was drinking. And then he decides to like start diving into the water. He's on a boat down at the Marina del Rey. He starts diving into the water around the boat. And he has this idea in his head that he's going to find some treasure down in the water. And he comes up, and the guy says, you know, first thing he brought up was like an old piece of rope. And I mean, he was just out of it. But he comes up and he tells the guy, guess what? I found a chest of gold. But he doesn't bring up a chest of gold. He says he found a chest of gold. He's drinking vodka. I mean, he's really loaded. And then he finds a bottle of wine on the boat, and he's drinking that. And then he doesn't come back up. And this guy thinks that he's just hiding from him. That's what he thinks at first. So, you know, and he's calling out, you know, hey, Dennis, what did you find? You know, come on, you know. Dennis doesn't surface, and Dennis is drowned. And that's how it ended. But, you know, I talked to ex-girlfriends of his, one of his ex-wives, people who could speak to kind of who he was and what, you know, but those last years of his life, that it was it's just really sad, you know, what happened.
And as an artist, he was coming into his own. He was putting out some good music, right?
Well, he made an amazing album. I mean, Pacific Ocean Blue, I think.
Right.
Yeah, here it is, Pacific Ocean Blue.
Yeah.
I mean, really, fantastic album.
And I believe it was about 5 years later, you interviewed Brian Wilson?
Well, the story with Brian Wilson was really quite, I mean, the whole thing was pretty incredible. I mean, because first of all, Brian Wilson, after so many years of basically being fucked up and not, I mean, Pet Sounds comes out and it's just unbelievably great. And it's still unbelievable. You listen to that album, there's a reason that album is considered one of the greatest albums ever made. And then he was working on the Smile album, which was never officially, you know, never really completed. He was getting messed up on, you know, drugs. And then that was kind of it. I mean, for years and years and years. And then he makes this solo album, his first solo album. I got played in advance of that album, and I thought it was just incredible. It's like Brian Wilson is back, you know, and if you listen to that solo album, it's a really great album. And so I was going to do a story about Brian Wilson and his new album. And so the thing was that this guy, Eugene Landy, was his therapist. Landy was this unusual guy who he had been the only person who had been able to sort of help Brian Wilson, like starting some years earlier. But he charged just an exorbitant amount of money. So now, at this point in time,
this is 1988, right?
Yeah. So Landy has basically he's got someone with Brian 24/7. And Landy is now taking credit as a songwriter on songs that Brian Wilson is writing. This is weird. This is a very unusual situation. So I ended up interviewing this guy Landy for like 8 hours, I think. I interviewed him for hours, and because I was trying to like get at what this guy was really about and what he was really doing here. So the story is about Brian Wilson at this moment in time, but it's also about what was happening to Brian Wilson at this moment in time and what this guy Eugene Landy was doing to Brian Wilson. And it's a weird thing because on the one hand, Eugene Landy was the reason Brian Wilson was able to make the solo album that he'd made. Brian Wilson was not doing drugs. He was not, shooting up. He was not dropping acid. He was not doing any of that while he was under Eugene Landy's care. Wilson was, schizophrenic. So Landy had him on a bunch of different drugs to kind of keep him under control, so to speak, keep himself under control so that he could actually do creative stuff and not just go the way of Dennis Wilson.
But he wanted in on some of the money that was going to come from this album. Is that what?
Oh yeah.
What the deal was? He wanted publishing, like he's putting. His name on
yeah, absolutely. He was not just wanted; he was getting.
He was getting. Okay.
And he was getting some huge amount of money per month being paid for him to keep Brian together. So I mean, I ended up hanging out with Brian Wilson as part of this for a number of days. I mean. And at one point, we were at his townhouse, Brian Wilson's townhouse, and there was a hot tub there. And so me and Wilson are in the hot tub, and he's telling me about hearing voices, and what these, voices telling him to do things. It was very surreal. I mean, wow. And there was this guy, this 24-year-old guy who was basically the one who was around Wilson 24/7. And, that guy had a room at the townhouse, and he was the one who dispensed the prescription drugs to Brian and made sure Brian took those drugs. Yeah, it was like he was like under lock and key in a way. I mean, while I was with him, they let me and Brian go drive somewhere to the store or something to get something, just the two of us. But that was the only time when I was there that Brian wasn't either with Landy or with this guy, this 24-year-old guy. And I mean, at one point, I think it's in the story, there's just a bunch of papers put in front of Brian for him to sign, and he's just signing them. Oh. He didn't know what he's signing.
How dangerous. Oh man.
So it was crazy.
Addicted to Noise, the music writings of Michael Goldberg. It is out now through Backbeat Books, and it is available wherever books are sold. People can find it anywhere, right, Michael? I mean, all the usual places.
It's available. It'll be available. Certainly, you can order it now at Amazon. It's available. Any bookstore, if they don't have it, you can order it and get it from them. If you're in England, you can get it. It's going to be available lots of places, as I understand it. And then I have a website called Days of the Crazy Wild, www.daysofthecrazy-wild.com. And there's information about the book there. I'm on Facebook, and there's stuff about the book, posting stuff about the book there.
I'll put those up on the show notes page. And there's so much more in this book that people can read. An article where you interviewed Frank Zappa and he took offense to the word freaky. You can read about that. You talked to John Fogerty, and he talks about the breakup of Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Rick James, including a jailhouse interview I did with Rick James.
Powerful interview. Yeah, he opens up about his addictions.
The story about the Flamin, groups like the Flamin Groovies, the interview with Neil Young.
Tom Waits is another one.
Yes, a previously unpublished and I think pretty hilarious interview with Tom Waits. story about Ramblin' Jack Elliott, the folk singer, Patti Smith, a very extensive interview that myself and Jan Uhelski did with Patti Smith, previously unpublished interview with Flipper, a band that heavily influenced Nirvana, extensive interview with Sleater-Kinney, Chris Isaac, Gil Scott-Heron, George Clinton. There's a lot of pieces in here. Prince. I mean, people will enjoy the stories about the bands that they like, but I also think that they'll enjoy the stories even of bands that they're not familiar with, or even artists maybe they don't like. I just think there's a lot of really well done pieces in here. I mean, I'm really proud of this work. And there's also a bunch of photographs that I took of artists, that are in this book. Photos that I took of Bob Dylan and Ramblin' Jack Elliott and a bunch of the other artists that are in this book.
Michael Goldberg, thanks, man. This was great.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate this.
And that'll do it for this episode. Thanks as always for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.